Hi, Lucy Spence here, and today I'm going to talk to you about generous reading. The reason I think generous reading is so important is because often as language arts teachers, we look at only the mistakes that children make, the incorrect spelling or the incorrect grammar, the lack of punctuation, things like that. But it's important to not be too critical of children's writing, even adolescents' writing, and especially English language learners' writing, because if we are too critical about those things, those mechanics of writing, eventually the students will quit writing, and that is not what we want. We want students to enjoy writing, to write more and more and more, because as they write more, they will become better writers, especially with support from their teacher. So I came up with this idea of generous reading. And generous reading means that you will look for what is good in the writing. You'll look for what the author is trying to tell you instead of critiquing it. So I think this is especially important with English language learners because in Arizona, where I taught 3rd and 4th grade English learners, I saw that often they were assessed in ways that were developed for native English speakers, and this was especially unfair to them because they were still developing their language as they were developing their writing ability. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about generous reading and how to do that with kids writing by showing you this table that I find very useful. Share it. I developed these tables to show you the tools that I use for generous reading. One of the things that you'll find in children's writing is family voice. That is something that's very, very common, that they'll write about their parents or their siblings or their cousins, and sometimes they'll even take on the voice of their mom or the voice of their dad in their writing. Sometimes they'll even quote mom or dad or other people in their writing. So family voice is one thing you'll hear. You'll also hear the voice of peers, and often this is playful talk, things to talk about with each other, kid talk, school phrases, rhyming phrases, things like that. And speaking of school phrases, often school culture will show up in student writing. You might hear the voice of the teacher, and you might hear the voice of things like policy, such as behavior or discipline procedures that might come out in the writing. Also, you'll hear often popular culture. You might hear name brands of things, or you might hear cartoons that are on TV or other shows that are on TV or movies that kids have watched. Also, there might be political events that show up in student writing because kids definitely pay attention to what's going on around them. And they hear the news and they hear their parents talking about the news, and especially traumatic events that happen in the world that affect all of us, those will show up in children's writing. So I'd also like to show you another table that shows some other ways of looking at kids' writing that help you to understand their writing from a different point of view. And that is literary elements or descriptive elements of student writing. So sometimes if you search for it, you might find figures of speech, such as metaphors or similes or hyperbole. Also, you might find other literary devices like alliteration often comes up, or repetition. Sometimes we think of repetition as negative, but actually it can be used to make emphasis. Binary opposites are really interesting to find. And sometimes you'll even find rhymes, and that the children have a natural understanding of how language sounds, how rhymes are an interesting way of putting language on paper. And also there might be other literary elements like mood or theme that come across. They may not always be there, but be alert for it when it is. Tension might be something that comes up. And speaking of descriptive elements, telling details are some things. Like if you really look for the details or even little descriptions such as the word little, you might find a really telling detail that can be really focused on to help understand what that writer's trying to say and how you can help that writer to say that. So these are the two things I look for when I do generous reading. I look for what kinds of voices are in the writing and what kinds of literary elements and descriptive writing is in it. So the next thing I want to do is to show you also an actual piece of children's writing. So I'm going to stop sharing this one. And I'm going to go over here to a third grade boy, and it's a very short piece, but it's a piece that we can practice on. I'll share this, third grade boy writing. So here it is, written in the original and then an edited version that was written so that you could understand it a little bit better. Then I was going to Mexico. It took us 4 hours to get to Mexico. I talked to my family. We played with the dogs. We went to the store. I played with my cousin. We played with a girl. We were talking about a scary story. The wind was noisy. Then I went to the gas station with my uncle. Then we came back. It was night. I went to sleep. In the morning, I ate eggs. It was time to go home. I said to my family, I am still hungry. So we went to McDonald's. Then we drove to my home. The end. Now, this is kind of a typical story. We used to call them a bed-to-bed story. It starts out, one day in the morning, and it goes through the entire day and through the night, wake up in the morning, and then what you did the next day. So we call those bed-to-bed stories because it tells all of those things that happen during the day. But we're going to move beyond that, and we're going to think about what are the voices in the writing. So some of the voices that I really noticed that stood out to me were the voice of Mexico. This is where this all took place. It was all about going to Mexico to see family. So family voice was also there. I played with my cousins. I went with my uncle, etc. Also, the voice of pop culture or fast food, McDonald's is in there. And I thought the voice of travel really came through. This was definitely a travel story. And then I also looked for figurative and descriptive language, of course. And some of that was scary story. So I thought this seemed really important because he included a detail that it was a scary story. And then he added on to it by saying the wind was noisy. So that was a very important element as well. I also noticed that he used capitalization in the words going and get, which seemed to make an importance to those words, right? Important words are capitalized. And so he capitalized going and get, which really seemed important to me. And beyond that, there were a lot of time sequence words like 4 hours, then, night, morning, the end. These are all time sequence words. So I thought, okay, I'm going to look at what this tells me about him as a person. And of course, it shows that he's close to his family and enjoys the social interaction, the playing with his family, going with his uncle, playing with the dogs. And also, it tells me that traveling to Mexico to see relatives is important. That's what he chose as his topic. And he has Mexico written in there a couple of times. He capitalizes it and he spells it correctly. Also, playing and scary stories seem to connect the children. Seems to connect the girl, the writer, the cousins. They all seem connected by the playing with the dogs, playing with each other, and also they seem to be connected with that scary story element that we all talked about, the scary story, which happened in the middle of the story, which actually adds importance to it because in the middle of the story is usually where the action takes place. So what does this tell me about the writer's process or the piece of writing itself? Well, it tells me that he understands that time sequence is important in personal narrative because he used all those time sequence words. Also, I think it tells me that he thinks about narrative in terms of individual events. So going with the uncle to the gas station, playing with the dogs, all of these are individual events. Now, I always think about what is the student doing especially well that I want to reinforce. That is so important to me because that's where teaching comes in. Teaching should start with what the student is doing right and build on that. So what I noticed was that he had an interesting topic. Travel to Mexico to visit family is a great topic for writing. And he also had an interesting detail, the scary stories and the wind noise, the noisy wind. So those are very important to stories, and I think really capitalize on that. I would also point out to him that he used time sequence words and phrases, and that's important to a narrative, and he understood that. So these are strengths of his writing that he should know what his strengths are. I really believe all children need to know what their strengths are in writing, and often we don't tell them, we're too busy correcting. So the next section of generous reading is to think, what can you teach that will help the student grow as a person or a writer? Because I always think of the student as a person as well. Writing helps you become the person who you are, I think. It helps you think through your ideas and your connections with others and with the world. So that's an important part of writing. So what I thought I would focus on with this student was that he could find that interesting part of the story when they were talking about the scary stories and then the wind started making noise. That is the exciting part of the story, and I would really love for him to focus on that, slow down that moment, maybe get rid of some of the extra things that don't have to do with that moment, and maybe just really embellish that so that we can see how this experience of talking scary stories and hearing the windy noise actually draws the cousins together and gives them this common understanding that they really enjoy doing with each other. Then the last thing I think about, that this is a recent addition to my thinking about generous reading, but I think that we always have to honor the students' language and their culture with a focus on academic success. And we can do that when we teach writing. So, I think one way to do this is to have him start a personal dictionary of all the English words that he spelled correctly in this story. He spelled many words correctly in this story, and I think those are real strengths that he can continue to draw upon as he writes other things. Also, I would like to ask him which other words he would like to add to his personal spelling dictionary. So perhaps the word cousin or one other word is something that he could add to his spelling dictionary. And this will help him focus on academic success in writing, and it also builds on what he's already doing well and the words from his own life and culture which he spells correctly, such as Mexico. So these are the two things that I would help the student with in writing conferences. I could even do lessons for the whole class on these things, is slowing down the moment, focusing on the important part of the story, and getting personal dictionaries going so that the students can build on what they know and increase their understanding. So I hope you enjoyed hearing about generous reading and that you will have some success in trying it with your own student writing. It's especially useful for English language learners, but it's a great way to begin looking at writing in a different way for all students.